Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Circular Cities, Reimagining Urban Systems and Economic Mobility Post-COVID-19. I am so excited to be here today to have this hour together with an awesome lineup of panelists to talk about circular cities, bringing this huge concept of circularity into practice within the context of cities. I do not need to reiterate the many adages about how disruptive, complex, and hard right now is. And the purpose of this conversation is to talk about what we can do with it, what that can mean within this context of cities, bringing together speakers from the public, private, and social sectors to talk about how to accelerate this moment towards a circular economy and what that needs to mean within the city context. So my name is Lauren Phipps. I am the Director and Senior Analyst on Circular Economy at GreenBiz Group, and I am joined by this awesome group. We have Suzanne Jones from EcoCycle. She's the Executive Director and former Mayor of Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Gary Cooper, the co-founder and CEO of Reaply, and my friend John Home, VP of Strategic Initiatives at Pixera Global. So before we get going, a little bit of context. We are discussing today within this webinar series called Paradigm Shift. It's building off of a publication by Pixera Global that brings together some of the most prominent voices in the circular space on what it'll take for the global community to make the transition to circularity. 3 authors, myself included, are on the call today, and this is the 4th in their webinar series. I think it's an amazing lineup of authors really talking about not just the what of circularity, not just the what of this new visionary economic model, but how and why and what that looks like, not just from the perspective of Fortune 500s, but on the ground in communities. And we're going to get into a bit more of that today. So going against what I just said, I want to talk about the how. I am going to start with the what. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just do a quick intro, a minute or two, on what is a circular city to you and what does that look like in practice? So Gary, can I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Lauren. And I'm so happy to be on the panel with John and Suzanne. So I think about a circular city starting with the kind of canonical definition of a circular economy, right? A circular economy within a geographically proximal or specific place. But I think it goes a little bit beyond eliminating waste and keeping materials in use and connecting end of life to beginning of new life for assets and resources and materials. From my seat, I think of circular cities as ultimate superconnectivity. I think about it being around social justice and equality within a city. And I think about it being like an economic change, systems change, how we think about cities are run, generally speaking. So I think it both kind of encapsulates the traditional or classic definition of circularity or circular economy, but I think it goes into how do we make urban areas more socially just and more equitable to everyone who lives with them.
Thank you. And we'll get into that a little bit more later in the program. But before I move on to Suzanne, can you spend just 30 seconds talking about what Reaply is for some context?
Yes, I'm always happy to talk about what Reaply is. So Reaply, even in our name, you could kind of see the words reapply. Reaply helps organizations or systems or organizations keep materials in use. And the way that we do that is to bring visibility and hopefully increase utilization of the assets or resources or materials that might be idle and surplus, and connect them to people who might make better use of them, whether within the same company or whether they're between different companies. So Reaply is trying to build the technology infrastructure to scale the circular economy, and we're doing that through technology here in Chicago.
Thank you. Suzanne, over to you. You bring 2 lenses to this conversation. What is a circular city? What does it look like? And what are you doing in this conversation?
Thanks so much, Lauren. Great to be here. I would build on what Gary already said about circular cities and say, as a nonprofit recycler, we're one of the oldest and biggest nonprofit recyclers in the country, that circular cities are so much more than just recycling. We'll be the first to say that. It's really about redesigning the whole system so there's not waste in the first place. So I think of the best metaphor is nature, right? You look at a forest, there is no waste in a forest, right? Nutrients are cycled. Something dies, it decomposes, it cycles through plants and animals and the whole chemical cycle. And then you try to apply that to human systems. And we've kind of created this notion of waste, which is an inefficiency in the system. And it leads to things like resource depletion, climate change, lack of equity, and all sorts of social justice challenges that flow from inequitable and inefficient use of resources. So a circular city is really trying to apply those concepts to how we run our systems. And so, for example, here in the Northern Front Range in Colorado, we do have circularity, say, around one material, and that would be glass, where you have a beer or some other beverage, you recycle it, it goes to the recycling center, it is sorted into little pieces and color-coded, and it goes back to the bottling company and made into bottles. So it's trying to get that more integrated into how we address all materials.
Thank you. John, over to you. What is a circular city?
Well, I mean, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off what Gary and Zan said. I agree with everything they said. And I think just, add a little bit more context. There are no good solutions in a bad system. And I think the current system, the take, make, waste model really is in circular economy kind of work at each other a little bit. And I think when you look at the circular economy or circular city, it's a new economic platform forward. Again, not just focusing on waste, but focusing on new economic models that act like a forest in its idealistic state, and then bringing in those threads and enabling social justice, enabling social equity, and enabling kind of an even playing field for people for better opportunities. I think the other thing I want to bring up here is when we look at it too, it's not just circular economy is not a buzzword. It's a new economic transition, a new platform, and I think when you say that, that requires the public, private, social sectors to work together to convene this transition. And so it's complex, it is big. And I think what we're looking at it with this transition, the timing is right now to have this discussion of what a circular city is and what it can be, and really dig deep with practitioners like Zan, Gary, and yourself on trying to reimagine a new and more equal world through circularity.
Well, I definitely want to live in the world that you all just described. So I want to talk a little bit about the enabling environment to make that happen. You each come from a very different perspective and place within the value chain, place within communities and cities. So Suzanne, I'll start with you because I want to talk about the US specifically and what role the public sector should play in enabling circularity and circular cities, and what would motivate the public sector. I mean, Boulder, where you were formerly the mayor, is pretty progressive, I think most people would say. So what did it take to really prioritize circularity there, and how do we help others in the public sector really make that a priority as well?
That's a lot of questions. I would say that the public sector plays a huge role in this and in transforming the system. At its base level, the public sector represents the desires and the ambitions of the people and is in charge of ensuring the public good. And we live in a capitalist society where the private sector is free to make things happen in the marketplace, but it's up to the public sector to put the guardrails on and say, we can't be having pollution, we can't be having, this much inequality, or we need to use recyclable materials in things that we make. And so the public sector role is paramount. And I would say all the more so in this day and age, as we're dealing with COVID and some pretty big economic disparities, cities and the public sector can't afford to do this like they have been doing it in the past. And we really need to change that. And I guess we'll talk more about this, to put more onus on the private sector to be more responsible for the materials and the products they put out in the world, rather than expecting cities and the public to figure out how to deal with every new kind of plastic that comes along and trying to figure out, can it be recycled and how do we recycle it and who pays for it? So the role of the public sector is important. Ideally, this would happen at the national scale, right? So that we'd have an even playing field and the rules would be clear. Right now, our national politics is in shambles. And so it's really falling to states, but even more so cities to lead the way. And whether it's Chicago or Boulder or Portland, Oregon, there's cities all over the country that are taking steps forward to change this paradigm. And that's the exciting news. We got a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of momentum around these ideas.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, global issues, whether we're talking about the pandemic, climate crisis, just our, I think, national especially, but also international reckoning around race, justice, and inclusion, they play out in cities, they play out in the local context, and it's often the local government that has to pick up the slack of, in the US context, where the federal government is not leading. So appreciate that context, Dan. And Gary, I'm curious if you can speak a little bit from the private sector perspective. Maybe it's up to the public sector to set up those guardrails, but what is the incentive for smaller companies, bigger companies, anyone in the private sector to actually engage in circular systems?
Maybe threefold, or maybe 1,000 things I can say about that. But just to keep it short, 3 things. The first is, I don't actually know of a more massive economic opportunity other than scaling the circular economy in the world right now. I think it's one of the things that I think people read about and there's a lot of concepts about. But if you're a business leader and you have an opportunity to participate in the circular economy, you're doing your shareholders and your employees a disservice by not. So I think it's a massive economic opportunity, just dollars and cents. Secondly, I think it's an imperative to keep the global marketplace going. If you read the great works of Google and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, what you know is, or what you see is, that if we don't scale the circular economy, we're all going to suffer from climate change, even if we move to all renewable sources of energy. So not only is it an economic opportunity, we have to keep the marketplace together. We're seeing what's happened in a pandemic when the marketplace kind of falls apart. And then third, I would say it's the frontier of innovation. So, Reaply is a startup, and we help be pushing our larger cousins, our larger brothers and sisters, bigger organizations, and doing some of the work that we're doing. So if you're not really operating in the circular economy within cities or within states, your business is not innovating on the front lines. And so those are a couple of reasons, but I probably could write a dissertation about why business should be participating in the circular economy.
Thank you. And John, how about over to you? And maybe if you can talk a little bit about enablers, but also in comparison to other places like Europe. I think it's pretty common to talk about the fact that Europe is way farther ahead when it comes to many facets of circularity. Why is that true? And what are some of those enablers that we need to be thinking about within the context of the US?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the US as well to really kind of move forward and kind of take the lead in circularity as well. But I think the question is really answering what Zan brought up earlier. First of all, if you look at legislation and regulation, there's a framework or guardrails in place that companies, that all sectors have to adhere to based on the voice of the people. What is lacking in the United States is that specific framework completely. It's not there. In fact, even when you look at recycling infrastructure, the fact of we don't even know if what we're saying is recycled is actually being recycled. And so I think that if you want to start by comparing Europe versus the United States, I think you first of all have to really start there. You have to start with the framework, and you have to start, for example, looking at the EU Green Deal and the circular economy bullet points they have laid in there of moving forward. They get it. They're really trying to push the needle to where they're holding not only consumers responsible for recycling, but also the producers of products, for example, and holding them accountable on what they can produce and what they can't produce. And I think until the United States gets to that point of being able to do that, it's going to be the Wild West a little bit. I think number two, Zan illustrated it really clearly. When you look at legislation, it's reverse. It's city first, then state, and then federal. I think though right now we're at a really good time where we can start testing out opportunities though, where we can start looking at cities and looking at progressive mayors who want to look at being inclusive and really rebuilding a circular city model that can actually in some ways, because of the United States sense of entrepreneurism and innovation, can move really quickly if we were all aligned on moving in the same direction. Given the current COVID-19 environment, we see that's kind of hard right now, but there's no reason to think that if we got the right legislation and some of the right examples moving us forward, that we really could paint a really pretty picture of circularity that competes with Europe.
While we're on the subject, Zan, I'd love to go back to you and get a little bit more specific about those guardrails. And John, you were sort of mentioning rhetoric around extended producer responsibility, but what are those guardrails? Like, what actually did you do in Boulder, and what are the specific types of things that cities, excuse me, should be thinking about?
Well, I think there's a lot we can learn from what's been done to date, and we're constantly looking from Boulder. We're constantly looking around to see who's doing what and how can we learn from them. But here in Boulder, you know, we started way back in the day. We were one of the first communities to have curbside recycling many decades ago, and we started out volunteer. We started out as people were concerned, making services accessible. And then eventually we said, you know what, we need to require this. Let's require that anybody that's going to haul trash in our community has got to provide recycling services. And we'll just make that a requirement. And the marketplace responded. Later we added composting and said, if you're going to, you know, haul in our community, you got to have them both, and they need to be embedded in the price. We stalled out at waste diversion. And we said, you know what, we need to be addressing businesses. There's this whole other side, you know, in addition to residential. And so we, you know, tried to encourage that voluntarily. And then eventually, a few years ago, we passed the Universal Zero Waste Ordinance and said every household, every business, every institution needs to have 3 bins: trash, recycling, composting. And that's going to be our new normal. We're going to change the culture around that and make that the level playing field. So not just the good actors, but everybody needs to do that. And so that's our new reality. And that's important, right? To make sure that everyone has access to sustainable services. And that should be part of the normal, just like utility. But that's not enough, right? Just to recycle at the end of the stream. We actually are realizing, and EcoCycle is part of this, is that we need to change the whole issue of producing waste in the first place, and that we need to be talking to producers about changing their packaging, changing what they're making stuff out of, so that it is inherently recyclable or it is reusable, even better. And so we are at those tables trying to push that. You know, if Coca-Cola is going to put plastic bottles out into the world, they need to help collect them, help pay for those collections, and use them to make more bottles. That they need to have, you know, higher recycled content. So we are both trying to implement solutions locally, figure out those models, export them, but then also be a part of these larger conversations about how you change the whole system. And I think we need to be working at these multiple levels to get there.
Definitely. And at least when I think about the idea of moving to this bold vision of a circular economy, a circular city, it's so important to hold that vision and to know kind of what we're aiming towards and for, but also recognizing that, hey, we're dealing with waste on a day-to-day basis, and we need to sort of be incremental in that way, so long as we're not just staying in the waste management mindset of a circular economy. So that's not what the vision that we're working towards is. However, it can be a really engaging and comfortable entry point for cities and companies to then get into some more uncomfortable conversations. It's kind of the way we entice them in through waste management, plastics and such. But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about something that you all named in your opening around what a circular city is, around economic mobility and environmental justice, around inclusion. And Gary, I'd love to start with you. How can a circular city actually empower more people into an economy, particularly folks that have been left out of these conversations and models in the past?
Yes, so there are many ways, and I'm sure that John and Suzanne have some ideas, and so I'll kind of speak to a couple that, you know, I and Reaply have been intimately working on. So one of them is through technology. One of the, I think, big things that we see right now with trying to figure out how school children who can't go to school can get lessons online is that there's a lot of folks who don't have broadband and who don't have access to Wi-Fi in these cities, and thus their children can equally learn as folks who do have access to that. So one thing that I think is important as we all think about how to make cities circular, how we make cities more sustainable, we have to think about how does every citizen in those cities participate in those plans and what effect does it have on their day-to-day lives. So one thing I've tried to do just as a thought leader in Chicago is to make sure that whatever we're working on thinks about the south side and west side of Chicago, not just the north and northwest side in the suburbs. So that's one thing. The second is that technology should be a leading way to connect disparate parts of the city so that people can equally participate in the opportunity that the circular economy affords. We talked about the word waste and how, and Suzanne said it right, that concept, as the scientists can tell you, doesn't even exist in nature. Like the word waste is not something that people talk about. It's a human construct. And so, but if we can design that thinking out, like waste is an opportunity, then that now economic opportunity of which something used to call waste. And I think, and I think Reaply thinks, that if we're able to reuse the things that we used to call waste in really cool, innovative, and sustainable ways, you actually start to open up new jobs and new business models and new economic opportunities for people who maybe couldn't participate in the old economy. And so I think both from just kind of a thought leadership and voice, I've been trying to give voice to make sure that we're designing sustainable solutions for every citizen and not just the privileged few. But then two, we at Reaply have been trying to make sure that we're building technology that does the connecting between those disparate stakeholders when we do start to move towards more circular cities and states. So those are a couple of things.
Can you give an example of, what that job creation could look like or has looked like, does look like?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did with the Office of the Mayor here in the city of Chicago, just around Memorial Day, was try to help small and local businesses get back online, who of course were very affected by COVID, but to reopen safely. And so the way that we did that is we developed and launched something called the Chicago PPE Market, which is just a digital marketplace, local to local, so that local small businesses who were selling PPE supplies, face masks, hand sanitizer, and the like, who would never get business on Amazon because there's a billion people selling those things on Amazon, they could actually sell it to local businesses and nonprofits who were looking for PPE. We were able to have massive success with that program, and actually in the immediate future, we're thinking about just a local to local marketplace and not just something specific to PPE. And so, if you think about that example and just put in as a placeholder instead of a local business person, a diverse or Black or brown business owner who has a local shop, trying to get them online, trying to make sure that their products can be locally sourced from people, consumers or businesses who might want it. It's definitely something that's a part of making small circles and making circular cities more operational. And so I think that's just a case example of where technology can play a part if you have the willing public leaders like Suzanne to really kind of have that public-private partnership.
That's awesome. And if you haven't heard about the work that Reaply and Gary have been doing in Chicago in the midst of the COVID crisis, it is really amazing, so helpful, and really making an impact on their local community and pivoting quickly, doing something that you were not doing before or doing it quite differently. So it's very worth reading up on if you're not familiar with it yet. Suzanne, back over to you. So in the context of circular cities, fairness, equity, inclusion, when you're thinking about making these shifts, who should be at the table? Who has to be at the table? And how do we actually get the right folks there versus it just being the same siloed group that I think have been responsible for creating the systems that we have now that aren't very inclusive, fair, or efficient?
That's a great question. I think at its basic level, the public needs to be at the table, in particular, impacted communities. And to build on what Gary was talking about, take the issue of plastics, right? The refineries, the plastic production facilities are often in low-income neighborhoods, just as landfills are often placed in low-income communities. And so this need to address circularity is in part because where the consumption is happening and where the production is happening and the impacts of that are very let's just say the same folks are not experiencing the impacts that are enjoying the consumption. And so we need to address that. We need to address it for our planet. We need to address it for social justice and equity. So we need to make sure those communities are at the table. I will also just add that this isn't just something that would be nice to do, circularity. It's actually something that's driven by some planetary imperatives. And I'll just add that one thing that Boulder discovered as we are connecting our zero waste ambitions with our climate change mitigation efforts is we had a consulting group called Metabolic Commando and Materials Flow Analysis of the city. And what we found was, we're kind of a high consumption city. But what we found is that the greenhouse gas emissions from our consumption eclipses that from our electricity, transportation, and heating. Okay, and a lot of the effort around climate is on those three sectors, and rightfully so. But what's missed is consumption and all the energy that goes in producing our food, our computers, our cars, our clothes, all that, which usually happens somewhere else than in our city. Those emissions aren't counted against us, and yet they're one of the largest sources of emissions that we are responsible for. So somehow, as we embrace circularity, we have got to figure out how we can account for greenhouse gas emissions, because it will really drive us to more circularity and better solutions. And I think Portland, Oregon actually provided a really good example of this. They did a climate plan where they looked at internal emissions, which leads to certain solutions like, hey, ride the bus, ride your bike. But they also looked at external solutions, which has to do with how much and how you consume. And that really changed the focus of their city's efforts. So I think that those are important elements to think about when we talk about who needs to be at the table, how big that table is, and how urgent this whole issue is.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing a growing conversation and area of attention on weaving together the ideas of circularity and climate change mitigation and prevention. And those are really the same. They're one and the same. And from my perspective, circularity is a way to achieve climate goals and a way to live within our planetary boundaries. And the report that Suzanne mentioned between Metabolic and Boulder is publicly available online. It is really well done. It has wonderful illustrations. So I'd recommend you go take a look at that. But John, you think and work a lot in the space of circular cities, specifically with that inclusive lens. And I'm curious if you can just sort of share what that actually means to you and what that's really looking like in practice, and maybe mention Chicago a little bit in there.
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, Zan's and Gary's points were spot on. I think that, referring to what Zan said and Gary said, is the ability to engage the new or citizens that have been left out into a new conversation. I don't think that's been happening before, and I think circular allows for that to happen. So I think when you look at inclusive means focusing on the entire city or the entire populations, not just pieces of it. And I think one thing I really want to allude to is the role of the private sector in the circular city context. We've been talking a lot about the public sector, a lot about the social sector and the racial inequities that are spread around cities. But I think one area where we really need to work together on is getting the private sector to look to engage in a circular city from the bottom line. So I think one thing that we see is a lot of talk in the space versus the reality of some companies, moving from product to service models. You're seeing I don't want to be a negative or Debbie Downer here. Again, there's a lot of data showing that companies, as Gary mentioned earlier, are trying to transition and go into a new circular economy model. And I think when you look at that, when you look at cities, the private sector has the ability to affect change much quicker at a much quicker rate when their business is investing on a problem. And I think what we're focusing on and what we look at, our hypothesis, is that a circular city can happen only if the public and private sector are working together in a clear and united vision of creating a circular city. It cannot happen on a silo. And so when you look at an example that we're looking to kick off in Chicago, our Circular Chicago Coalition is bringing the best of the brightest public sector, social sector, and public sector advocates to come around and rally around affecting legislation for the city to affect the west and south side of Chicago, using the private sector to invest in areas of the south in West Side and East Side of Chicago to invest in an enabling environment for economic mobility and economic gain. And I think there is a template for that. I think one thing, if you look at with Pixar Global, we worked with clients, for example, like JP Morgan Chase, who looked at investing in the city of Detroit, and they invested into Black-owned businesses and cities and people of color, and actually were able to successfully transition a lot of Detroit into a better economic reality by focusing on those underserved populations. Moving forward, this is not a plastic game. This is not an issue of just packaging. I want to be very clear that when you look at circular cities, they're a product of, as Gary referenced earlier, they're a gateway into a conversation, but they're just a piece of it. Recycling infrastructure is a piece of it. What the lead of a circular city and what we're focused on Chicago is enabling economic opportunity for those who've been left out of the conversation, and focusing on the business, focusing on the bottom of the pyramid, not just the Whole Foods, Patagonia, Lush model, which only allows certain people with income to participate in, but it focuses it on for everyone. And so there'll be more developments as we go, but I think, as you referenced earlier, the other point I want to bring up, you all brought up metabolic. I mean, metabolic is seeing some of this work already in Europe. In 22 cities, they're working on already doing circular design. So I think where the United States can really make a tremendous jump ahead is looking at this from an economic opportunity and not just a recycling opportunity.
And Lauren, if I may just add to one of the comments that John made, that I like to think about from a RIPI perspective, is that the beautiful thing about the circular or circle is that if you're on it, we're all equal, right? We all have the same opportunity. And I think there's one kind of hesitance that some businesses larger, much larger than RIPI, have in working with people who they might deem to be or who might be their competitors. When you're in the same city, it behooves us all to kind of figure out, how do we make the marketplace more sustainable, more equitable? That economic growth lifts us all up. So I think it's for sure fusing the partnerships between public and private, but there are also some private conversations and partnerships that have to be fused in order for us to really get where we need to go when it comes to making cities really circular.
Absolutely. And
hey, can I jump in on that too? And that, in addition to private, social enterprise.
Yes.
One of the things EcoCycle does with the city is we run a Center for Hard to Recycle Materials yard. It was one of the first of its kind in the country, but it was to deal with that percentage of the waste stream that it's recyclable, but it's not single stream. So everything from mattresses to toilets to scrap metal. And we partner with other social enterprises like Springback, Colorado, hires ex-felons to take apart and recycle mattresses. And so it's one of those win-win-wins where folks who are hard to employ and get back in on their feet are given a new lease on life. We deal with one of the issues of that fills up landfills. Mattresses are notorious for taking up a lot of space, and they're inherently recyclable. So that's just an example of how can we create more circles within circles, as you said, and address multiple social values. We also partner with Blue Star Recyclers. They hire folks along the autistic spectrum who are very good at certain mechanical jobs like recycling electronics. So we hired them to come on. They are housed within our yard now to do that part of the waste stream. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial parts of this too that I think can address multiple things. I guess the last thing I would mention along the economic part is we worked hard with the Colorado General Assembly to pass legislation just this past summer to create, it was an end markets bill to set up a center like they've done in Arizona and North Carolina with their universities to really look at, okay, somebody's waste stream is another entrepreneur's feedstock. And how do we bring businesses to address this issue and create jobs and create more economic value rather than just burying stuff in a landfill? Let's create some more economic activity around that. So those are some of the positive things. In addition to the imperative to act, there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities for folks both the folks that have been left behind and corporations to get in on this circularity effort.
That's a great point, Zan. Thank you. And John, I think you had something you wanted to add to that, and wondering if you might also want to piggyback on Zan's point about kind of what we're seeing pop up in different cities and those specific models that she'd mentioned.
Yeah, I think two things. I think once I want to piggyback on Gary's circle comment, but looking at private and private partnerships. I mean, I think one thing that we've seen in the space and something to applaud is companies who are competitors working together to go out and do something and take action. So if you look at, for example, the great work that Closed Loop Partners and Kate Daly is convening, first with the cup initiative and now with the plastic bag initiative with Kroger and many leading grocers on creating a new shopping bag. I think that's something that should be applauded. But I want to also go back a little bit to the system is broken and there's opportunity for a new system to be created. And I say that when I want to provide one example from a private sector company who is went from a linear take, make, waste to now is moving to a service. And that's Philips Lighting, based in the Netherlands. And Netherlands is always a hotspot for circular conversations, but I think it's important to note that Philips, instead of just working on how many light bulbs they're producing and selling light bulbs at how much you can produce at the lowest cost, they turned that model on its head to do service contracting, where essentially, for example, with Schiphol Airport, it's not how many light bulbs the airport needs, it's how much light the airport needs to operate. And that incentivized Philips to change their business model around building longer lasting products that last longer, because it makes more sense economically to consume less if you have a service model that provides that platform. And I think when you look at some of the examples in the space, whether it's Gary's model at Repley, you look at Philips, who's a big company making that transition, or even we got to applaud Danone, who moved to a B Corp to really try to be better at blending their profitability versus their stake, their shareholder value for social good. I think there's models that we need to do a better job of highlighting and replicating as well. And I think the thing that I want to really bring up with circular cities, especially what we're trying to develop together in Chicago with Gary and Zan and some other participants as well, is really look at it through that type of thinking, the reduce, the reuse, the service modeling side. Really focus on the economic opportunity and those buckets, and then have that waste streams, which are very important, and they have those effects that, as Zan mentioned. I'm not saying they're not, but focus on the economic benefit of maybe those other models, and then bring those and raise those up.
Absolutely. And to your point about pre-competitive collaboration and not wanting to recreate the same solutions that we already have. I mean, Closed Loop Partners, Next Gen Cup Challenge and Consortium is a great example of that in a lot of ways. I mean, you bring together McDonald's and Starbucks, who are competitors, and they did this huge innovation challenge and accelerator, and of the final solutions, many of which are being piloted right now. I think the majority of them are reuse systems where it's not just, okay, we're going to figure out what to do with the waste we create. Some are new materials solutions, which in certain contexts make sense, and we will not go down the rabbit hole of single-use plastics and access and all of that right now, but it's another piece of this. But new models is a part of it, and we've seen some great examples of what that can mean for the cup. We'll see it for the bag, and I think beyond just those specific materials in cities, there's such a huge opportunity. We've gotten some great audience questions so far, and want to encourage anyone listening in, please ask your questions in the question pod, and we'll get to as many as possible. But before we do that, Zan, a question for you that we've kind of been circling around a little bit. I want to talk about incremental versus systems change, and how cities and maybe how Boulder has been thinking about that, what it took to get from that waste management, recycling materials perspective to one where you're thinking about climate, where you're thinking about resilience, where you're thinking about equity and inclusion. Like, how do you get from one to the other, and what did it take for Boulder to actually think bigger than just materials and waste?
Great question as well. I think I am reminded of Bill McKibben's quote that says, when it comes to climate, winning slowly is the same as losing. And we're at a place, I think, in our human history that we need to take some big steps. But I also want to honor that we kind of got to meet people where they are. We got to meet cities where they are. And right now, not everybody's politics allows for big steps. I do think that there is a growing awareness, certainly in Boulder, but I think in so many places around, hey, wait a minute, we are, take plastics. I keep coming back to plastics. There's a lot of concern that we're going to have more fish, or we're going to have more plastic than fish in the oceans by 2050 at the rates we're at. You know, that has captured people's imagination, and suddenly there's an opportunity to act. And so I guess in Boulder, I feel like there's always been kind of a conversation about what else should we be doing? If we can lead, we should lead. And there's been, because we're progressive, there's a real appetite for figuring out what else we should be doing. And certainly climate change requires that of us. I think that this is where the role of the public sector comes in. And I think while we want to capture the imagination of the private sector, I think in the end, the public sector needs to say like things such as, you know what? Single-use disposables are wasteful from an environmental perspective, from a resource perspective. They're unnecessary to use fossil fuels to create a product that's used so for a few minutes and then is buried forever, but never goes away. So anyhow, the role of the public sector to set those guardrails and say, you know what, we're not going to do that anymore, is so important here. And again, even though we're recyclers, we'd love to be put out of business by reuse. And so that is a big part of what we do as well. So I think the public is, the public is waking up to the importance of action and the desire to act. And again, it cuts across social justice and environmental issues. People are in the streets demanding change. And so it's a really exciting time to step in with some much bigger solutions. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think the public is providing the juice. We need to capture that energy and point in towards solutions that we know work. And I look to Europe. I look to things like there's national legislation, Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, that Senator Udall and Representative Lowenthal that have introduced, that it's not just about plastics, it's about this whole idea of trying to reduce waste in the first place, that provide really hopeful solutions that I think capture the imagination of the public to make progress on these things as well.
And just to add a little bit to that, Lauren, if you don't mind, one of the things that I love everything about Reaply. One of the things I love most about Reaply are who our stakeholders are, which are the employees of companies, which are the students at universities, which are the workers in government. And when you look at the news, I'm sure we can all reference something like the Harvard-Yale game, where there was a student walking about Harvard and Yale investing in fossil fuel companies, and they stopped the game during halftime. Or if you look at some of the, I won't name the companies, but some of the biggest companies in the world and the kind of rebuke that their employees have had about their sustainable or practices, there is a movement going on at the grassroots level of people who are fed up and tired of, whether it be a politician, whether it be a CEO, whether it be a provost or a president, so I don't want to be a part of an organization who doesn't invest in my long-term health and well-being on this planet. And so I think if folks aren't listening to structuring circular cities or circularity generally, they're going to get moved by their end user or their end stakeholder one way or the other.
I think that ties in really well to a question that we got from the audience that I imagine you'll perhaps take issue with the framing of, but I'll just read it as is. So getting to the public to the table involves having them understand or care about the outcomes. When their essential needs are their priority, is it difficult to get them to the table? How do you reconcile this? So do you have thoughts on that based on what you just shared?
I have some thoughts on it. I think that a little bit to Suzanne's point is that, not everyone, it's not a monolithic thought process, right? I mean, people have different ideas about the concept of circularity and circular cities. I think that then means that people have different cares and wishes about its impact and its effect. So I'm not saying that there isn't great debate still needed about how do you operationalize this? Is it the same in Chicago as it is in San Francisco, as it is in New York? Probably not. All I'm saying is that every arrow is pointing towards action, And every minute that we all spend talking, writing, thinking, wishing about what we could have done yesterday is a moment that we've mortgaged to our future and probably our kids and grandchildren's future. So I don't know what the solutions are everywhere, but I'm willing to do the experiments and work with public and private partners to kind of figure it out.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think the question around getting the public to the table and, you know, having alignment in what we're actually achieving, you've all spoken to in some ways, because it's not about, you know, we're not talking about this myopic understanding of circularity through the lens of just materials and recycling. It's about resilience, it's about human life, it's about jobs and economic opportunity and equity. And I think any solution that just looks at materials as something singular and divorced from the rest of the system is really missing out on what this vision of circularity is and ought to be, which is one that reimagines and creates a better experience, and one that doesn't just recreate some of the challenges that are rife in our linear system. So another audience question that is similar to this, and John, I wonder if you'll have a thought on this. Circularity and the jargon around it, and the way that it's communicated, is often elite and it's divorced from layman's language. Is there a way to assuage this and to truly communicate impact? John, and then Zan and Gary, curious if any of you have thoughts on that, but John, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that we look at buzzwords and themes that are out in the space, and we you know, the idea of a circular economy has been around since the beginning of time. It's not new, and I think that when you look at, you know, the great work that Ellen MacArthur Foundation did 10 years ago, I think the only thing, and Gary and I were talking about this actually earlier today, is the timing of circular economy now, the timing of these conversations, the timing of a circular city. We could have been having this conversation 10 years ago and know the exact same stuff that all we're talking about, but the timing allows for people now to pay attention. And I think what's really important to do is that in the cities we live in the places that are our homes, it's important to engage communities to understand what it's not monolithic, right? As Gary said, to engage on what that means to them, because it does have meaning, and to be able to use it as a way to talk to people you haven't talked before, as a model that is inclusive, that can raise up economic levels, but also just improve the health of the planet. So I think we're at a time now where you see public, private, social actors leading this charge. I mean, if you're looking at it from a bell curve, you're at the beginning stage where I think it's starting to scale. But I think until the private and public sectors work together in unison to give a model, to give people something clear of what it could be, it's going to be stuck. And I think that's what we're all trying to talk about today, is creating that model, create that framework for people to reference, a frame of reference to go, that's what a circular city can be. That's what it looks like. And I think that's up to us and these leaders in the room. And Lauren, you're getting ready to convene an amazing group of people next week with Green Business Circularity, change agents, to be able to get the conversation from the siloed few to the many. And I think if anything of our mandate is to be able to do that and hopefully provide an example, and maybe use the Chicago model we're creating, or the great work that Zan did in Boulder, but really create that model for people to look to as a North Star, as a way of saying, this can make my world a better place.
Can I jump in? Oh, go ahead.
Zan, let's start with you, and then Gary, I'll go to you.
Okay. Well, I would say some of these, I mean, the jargon may be new, the concepts are old. Remember waste not, want not? Like, wasn't that our grandparents growing up in the Depression? This idea that you don't waste things, that you reuse things, that you share things. Those are old, ancient concepts, and it's kind of funny how we're coming full circle to realize some of the older ways, older systems had a lot of value in them. I'll just say that people want good choices, right? They want a clean environment. They want to have better choices. If they could have clean energy, they would like clean energy. And I think that's the system. We're trying to create a system that provides those choices, and people will make good choices if they have the option. I also wanted to give another example, and that has to do with composting, which is another form of recycling. You know, 40% of our waste stream is organics. And right now, a lot of that's sent to a landfill where it rots and produces methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. But instead, an old ancient solution that is circular is to wait. Let's make that into compost, all those organics into compost. Let's do it at a community scale so it goes back into people's backyards, on the farms, on the parklands to rejuvenate our soils. And oh, by the way, we're finding out that healthier soils sequester more carbon, right? Photosynthesis. You grow bigger plants that sequester more carbon. And this is one of the most promising, hopeful solutions that comes to climate change. And it's very circular. It's ancient technology. It's using Mother Nature to help heal what we've done to the atmosphere. And so I guess there's a lot of hope in this, and it's, anyhow, just because it's jargony doesn't mean it's not really well versed in science, in really robust solutions. And I think people are hungry for them, and they will make the right choices if we create the systems that provide that.
Completely.
And just quickly to add to that, I think one of the ways to dispel jargon is that everyone is talking about it, right? I think mayors, I think governors, I think presidents, I think CEOs, and I think supply chain leaders, I think business school leaders, I think community leaders and nonprofit leaders should all be talking about what circular economy is, what circular cities are, and what it means for their organization, system, business, whatever their infrastructure is. And the more people, different stripes and colors and creeds, that talk about this concept, it doesn't become jargon. No one really knew what the concept of shared economy was 12 years ago. And now everything is shared, right? So to add to everything John and Suzanne said is correct. I would just only add that things like this is important so that more of us are talking about it in our own groups. And the more that happens, the more it becomes the age-old thing that's already existed and not just a new label over the last 10 or 15 years that we've added.
Totally agree. And I think it's okay for language to evolve. There's semantic debates about, is it this thing or that thing, or what are we calling it? And right now, the word resilience is really resonating with people, and that's okay. It's okay that might be a word that we're using a lot more than we might have earlier last year. And my shameless plug will be, if you want to be a part of broader conversations around all of this and hearing from all the stakeholders that Gary mentioned, GreenBiz is convening Circularity 20 next week. We're expecting 10,000 registrants from primarily North America, but yesterday I checked 109 countries represented. For 3 days, it's totally free virtual conference on what it takes to accelerate the circular economy. And we've gotten so many amazing questions around PCR and virgin pricing, recycling policy, examples of pre-competitive collaboration, biological cycles, and we cannot get to all of those today, but all of those will be covered in some capacity next week. So hope you can join us there. But we are running out of time, and I want to think about how we bring this forward. We know that there's this bold vision that we want to work towards. We know some of the levers we should be pushing. And right now, everything feels really intense. The context, as we discussed, is very heightened. And I'm curious if each of you can speak to how to create that sense of urgency when we're not in a pandemic. How do you create that sense of urgency for change, for being mindful of engagement with communities, equity, inclusion, mindful of all of these challenges that the pandemic has laid bare, but have been around for a very long time? What do you all think about how we create that urgency and keep this momentum going as we move forward? Zan, maybe to you first, Gary, then John.
Okay, here's the answer. I actually think that the circumstances of the day are providing this sense of urgency, both on climate. Out here in the West, things are on fire, right? It's hot, it's dry. Colorado was just declared to be in a drought. We've got 4 major wildfires. It's a bad air day because of all the smoke. So people are on edge about that. We've got, with I don't know how many days of protest now since the killing of George Floyd, but that is providing a lot of impetus for change, and people are manifesting this desire. So I think in a lot of ways, the urgency is there, and now we need to channel it into solutions and opportunities for progress. And so I think, as Gary said, us talking about here are the ways we can move forward together, and talking about it and engaging people and including bigger audiences is part of the solution. I will say this, it's also a multi-pronged solution, right? We talked about we need to redesign packaging, redesign systems. We need to, use recyclable materials. We need to use less materials. We need to figure out a better system to collect those materials and put them back into the system. And we need to change so that the producers are responsible and have more skin in the game to pay for the end result of their products, right? Those are all important elements. And I am encouraged by how many people are coming to the table with pieces of that solution. And I think the public is hungry to push for a more comprehensive system change. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's part of the answer.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, I'm largely in step with exactly what Susan is thinking. One of the things that Bill Clinton said that I always keep in my mind when I think about even our business is the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. I take that to mean that, we do have a pandemic going on and people's lives are at risk. This is the exact time that we should be thinking about how do we make ourselves more resilient as we're coming out of this, hopefully, for the next pandemic. And let's not forget it, on the front of Time magazine, I think a month ago, climate crisis. Though we're in a pandemic, we're in a global crisis, as Suzanne was just saying. So my sense is that everyone should have urgency about this. Every smart mind in my mind, I got out of science and now I'm working in sustainability. Everyone should be thinking about this because the problems are hard, the changes are necessary. And I think while the sun is shining, while we're coming up with ways to kind of maybe get our society back out of this pandemic, it's the exact time to think about how do we not repeat what just happened and how we make our systems much more resilient and redundant going forward.
I don't know if I would say that right now it feels like the sun is shining completely. I feel like we're in the middle of like a wild hailstorm trying to fix a roof. But I think the point about, taking advantage of every opportunity, whether things are going well or not, is the time to act and act
Absolutely.
now. And John, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to follow up on what Zan and Gary said. I mean, I think the only addition is that essentially we are in crisis. It's going to continue being in crisis. I mean, it's not like there's a silo of a COVID done and then we can go back to reality. Our new reality is that nothing is on a silo, whether that is the circular economy or whether that is our climate / long problem of colonial and systemic racism. I think what we're at right now, though, is the timing and the opportunity to work together with a model, like a circular city model, that can work to address multiple problems at the same time. It does not make sense to address one thing on its own anymore. It makes sense to address something that's complex, but can solve complex problems additional to just one siloed issue. And so I think moving forward, I look at the circular city as an opportunity to not to reinvent, to invent something that can be a better system for us to work in to move forward. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really make progress in a really inspiring way that can benefit the many, not just the few.
Well said. Well, unfortunately, we are nearly at time. So I want to thank very deeply our wonderful panelists, Gary Cooper, Suzanne Jones, and John Holm, for this wonderful conversation. If you have not looked at the Paradigm Shift publication, it is a wonderful collection of thoughts, perspectives, and visions on how to build the future that we've all talked about, what to imagine and reimagine, create and recreate. And this conversation has been a great one to really emphasize that it needs to be for everyone. It needs to be not recreating the world that we already have, and one that's inclusive, resilient, regenerative, and just better. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, be well.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Lauren.